The enroute checklist, your secret weapon for command success, or how not to spectacularly fail at 36,000 feet. Welcome to Captain's Chair, where I expose the airline industry's best-kept secrets. If you're watching because you think the cruise phase is just about setting the autopilot and relaxing, congratulations. You've fallen for aviation's equivalent of thinking brain surgery is just about having a steady hand and not sneezing at the wrong moment. The reality? The cruise phase for airline captains is to basic flying what quantum physics is to counting on your fingers. I'm Captain James, and after decades flying the Airbus fleet, I've developed an enroute checklist that has not only enhanced my operational awareness, but has also impressed countless examiners during command assessments, which, let's be honest, is the aviation equivalent of getting your mother-in-law to finally admit you're not completely useless. Today, I'm diving into the world of the enroute checklist, a systematic approach that separates the commanders from the pilots who are merely along for the ride and secretly hoping no one asks them a difficult question. And by the way, if you want to master this material, I've created templates for breaking down these elements in my command books on Amazon. You just need to fill in the blanks for your own area of operations. It's like a choose your own adventure book. Except the adventure is don't get fired or crash, and the choices are all terrifyingly specific regulations. Let's start with why an enroute checklist is so critical. Most new pilots think cruise is just about monitoring systems and waiting for descent. Essentially, the aviation equivalent of highway driving on cruise control while eating a sandwich and wondering if that weird noise has always been there. But what separates airline captains from the rest is using this time to proactively assess the entire operation and prepare for what's ahead. This is something I do every single day I go flying. Once we reach cruise altitude, I systematically work through my enroute checklist to ensure I've covered all critical aspects of the flight. It's not just about delaying those probing questions from examiners during command training. It's about enhancing situational awareness and proactively addressing potential concerns before they become problems. You know, like how you check WebMD before going to the doctor, except in this case, the diagnosis isn't always terminal cancer. Let's dive into the key elements that your enroute checklist should include. First and foremost, fuel. As captain, you are ultimately responsible for the fuel on board. Your enroute checklist should prompt you to pay close attention to fuel quantity and consumption, check fuel usage against the flight plan, and cross-check the fuel quantity in individual tanks. I always use a calculator for these checks. Mental math is fine for basic calculations, but precision matters when you're responsible for hundreds of lives and not just trying to figure out if you can afford that extra guacamole at Chipotle. It's like the difference between casually glancing at your car's fuel gauge and meticulously tracking your mileage during a cross-country road trip. I once observed a captain who discovered a significant fuel imbalance during his en route checks, something that would have gone unnoticed without his systematic approach. His proactive fuel management prevented what could have become a much more complex situation later in the flight, like having to explain to 200 passengers why they're now landing in Nebraska instead of New York. Next, winds. Your checklist should remind you to confirm that the cruise winds are accurately loaded into the flight management system. This is a key factor in fuel consumption and estimated time of arrival. I always compare the winds we're experiencing with what was forecast. Significant differences can affect everything from fuel planning to passenger connections, to whether the crew gets to go home that night or ends up sleeping in a hotel that has the distinct ambience of a 1970s crime scene. One engine drift down altitude is another critical item. In the event of an engine failure during cruise, you need to know the appropriate altitude to descend to for optimal single-engine performance. Your checklist should prompt a review of these altitudes, considering both the standard strategy using LRC speed and the obstacle strategy using green dot speed if terrain is a factor. And yes, I know green dot speed sounds like something from a children's cartoon about racing snails, but trust me, it's vitally important. This isn't just academic knowledge. It's the difference between confident command and confusion during an emergency. I once had a colleague who hadn't reviewed his drift-down altitudes during cruise. When we experienced an engine abnormality that required reduced thrust, He spent precious minutes trying to determine the appropriate altitude while I was already preparing for the potential descent. His face resembled someone who just realized they'd been studying for a history exam when they were actually taking calculus. A look I call the pilot's existential crisis. Unreliable airspeed procedures should also be on your en route checklist. While hopefully a rare occurrence, being mentally prepared for this and knowing the initial actions is vital. I always review the pitch and power settings that would be required if we suddenly lost reliable airspeed information. It's like having a plan for what to do if your speedometer suddenly shows you're doing 500 miles per hour in your Toyota Corolla. Unlikely, but catastrophic if you don't know how to handle it. Grid moorers or minimum off-route. Altitude is essential, especially when flying over mountainous terrain. Your checklist should remind you to evaluate the grid moorers for your route, ensuring safe altitudes are maintained even if you deviate from your planned track. This becomes particularly important if you need to divert or experience a pressurization issue requiring an immediate descent. Because avoiding mountains is generally considered a fundamental aspect of successful aviation. Weather is a continuous consideration. Your en route checklist should prompt you to check the latest weather for your route, your destination, and any potential alternate airports. I always review the weather at our destination and alternates during cruise. Conditions can change rapidly, and staying ahead of these changes is a hallmark of good command. It's the difference between being the captain who confidently announces, "We'll be landing in 30 minutes," and the one who has to say, "Surprise! We're going to Cleveland instead because I didn't check if our destination was currently experiencing what meteorologists are calling the storm of the century." Fuel log maintenance is often delegated to the first officer, but as captain, you have overall responsibility. Your checklist should include a reminder to ensure the fuel log is being accurately maintained. This isn't about micromanaging. It's about maintaining awareness of a critical aspect of the flight. It's like checking that your teenager actually did their homework instead of just saying they did while secretly watching TikTok videos about how to make slime out of household chemicals. Considering potential emergencies, your en route checklist should prompt you to confirm the emergency airports you might need and the location of equitime points ETPs. Knowing which airports are available along your route and how long it would take to reach them in various emergency scenarios is fundamental to good command. It's like the difference between driving through remote areas without a map versus having detailed knowledge of every service station and hospital along the way. I once had to divert to an airport that wasn't our filed alternate due to a medical emergency. Because I had reviewed all potential emergency airports during my en route checks, I was able to make a quick, informed decision rather than scrambling to gather information under pressure while simultaneously trying to remember if blue or purple is the worst color for a passenger's face. If your route takes you over high terrain, reviewing emergency routes should also be on your en route checklist. These predetermined paths ensure you can safely navigate to an emergency airport even with an engine failure or pressurization issue. Think of it as your plan B for when plan A goes spectacularly wrong, which in aviation can happen with the suddenness and ferocity of a toddler's tantrum in a quiet restaurant. As you approach your destination, your en route checklist should prompt you to consider landing distance and arrival fuel. Calculating the expected landing distance and assessing how much fuel you anticipate having on arrival, along with the options that fuel provides, is a proactive step that demonstrates command thinking. It's the difference between the captain who knows exactly what they'll do if the primary runway is closed and the one who responds with "we can do that" when ATC suggests an alternative. After completing your en route checks, providing a quick overview to your crew of your fuel status, drift down altitudes, landing distances, and any other pertinent information demonstrates that you are in command and proactively managing the flight. This can preempt many questions and shows your preparedness. It's also a great way to assert dominance in the cockpit without having to resort to bringing in a slightly larger coffee mug than everyone else. So, what does all this mean for you as an aspiring airline captain? It means that developing and using a comprehensive en route checklist is not just about ticking boxes. It's about demonstrating the proactive and organized approach expected of a successful airline captain. It's the difference between being the captain everyone wants to fly with and being the one who inspires passengers to write their wills on cocktail napkins. Start by building a structured method for reviewing these critical elements during cruise. Create your own template that forces you to actively engage with every item. Don't just note the information, understand why it matters and how it contributes to flight safety. It's like the difference between memorizing that 2 + 2 = 4 and understanding the concept of addition. Except in this case, getting it wrong doesn't mean a bad grade. It means explaining to investigators why you thought Greenland was a suitable emergency landing site for a 737. Practice making command decisions based on the information gathered during your enroute checks. Don't just ask, "What's our fuel status?" Ask, "What options does our current fuel status give us? What contingencies have we planned for? And if things go terribly wrong, how long before we're featured in an air disasters episode with dramatic reenactments and somber narration?" The good news? You don't need to wait until you're in command training to start building these habits. You can begin incorporating this level of detail into your flight planning right now, giving you a massive advantage when you eventually step into the left seat. It's like practicing for the Olympics while everyone else is still trying to figure out which end of the pool to dive into. If this episode saved you from the shock of discovering that cruise phase management is to basic autopilot monitoring what conducting an orchestra is to banging 2 sticks together and calling it music, hit subscribe and join me next week when we dive into another critical aspect of airline operations that flight schools conveniently forget to mention, like how to maintain your dignity when the hotel shuttle leaves without you and you have to walk through the terminal in full uniform, dragging your luggage like a disgraced penguin. This is Captain James, signing off from the captain's chair, where we tell you what they don't want you to know, mainly because it would make for awkward conversation in the board.